Bhagavad Gita.
The Bhagavad Gita, literally meaning the Song of the Bhagavan, often referred to as simply the Gita, is a 700-verse scripture that is part of the Hindu epic Mahabharata. It is a sacred text of the Hindus. The Gita is set in a narrative framework of a dialogue between Pandava Prince Arjuna and his guide Lord Krishna. Facing the duty to kill his relatives, Arjuna is exhorted by his charioteer, Krishna, among others, to stop hesitating and fulfill his kshatriya, warrior, duty as a warrior and kill. Inserted in this appeal to kshatriya dharma, heroism, is a dialogue between diverging attitudes concerning and methods toward the attainment of liberation, moksha. The Bhagavad Gita presents a synthesis of the Brahmanical concept of dharma, theistic bhakti, theurgic ideals of liberation through jnana, and Samkhya philosophy. Numerous commentaries have been written on the Bhagavad Gita with widely differing views on the essentials. Vedanta commentators read varying relations between self and Brahman in the text. Advaita Vedanta sees the non-dualism of Atman and Brahman as its essence, whereas Bhaktipada and Vishishtadvaita see Atman and Brahman as both different and non-different, and Dvaita sees them as different. The setting of the Gita in a battlefield has been interpreted as an allegory for the ethical and moral struggles of the human life. The Bhagavad Gita's call for selfless action inspired many leaders of the Indian independence movement including Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who referred to the Gita as his spiritual dictionary.
Composition and significance. Authorship.
The epic Mahabharata is traditionally ascribed to the sage Ved-Vyasa. The Bhagavad Gita, being a part of the Mahabharata, is also ascribed to him.
Date of composition.
Theories on the date of composition of the Gita vary considerably. Scholars accept dates from 5th century to 2nd century BCE as the probable range. Professor Jeanine Fowler, in her commentary on the Gita, considers 2nd century BCE to be the likely date of composition. Kashinath Upadhyaya, a Gita scholar, on the basis of the estimated dates of Mahabharata, Brahma Sutras, and other independent sources, concludes that the Bhagavad Gita was composed between 5th and 4th centuries BCE. It is generally agreed that, unlike the Vedas, which have to be preserved letter-perfect, the Gita was a popular work whose reciters would inevitably conform to changes in language and style, so the earliest surviving components of this dynamic text are believed to be no older than the earliest external references we have to the Mahabharata epic, which may include an allusion in Panini's 4th century BCE grammar. It is estimated that the Sanskrit text probably reached something of a final form by the early Gupta period, about the 4th century CE. The actual dates of composition of the Gita remain unresolved.
Hindu synthesis and Smriti.
Due to its presence in the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita is classified as a Smriti Canon text or that which is remembered. The Smriti texts of the period between 200 BCE 100 CE belong to the emerging Hindu synthesis, proclaiming the authority of the Vedas while integrating various Indian traditions and religions. Acceptance of the Vedas became a central criterion for defining Hinduism over and against the heterodoxies, which rejected the Vedas. The so-called Hindu synthesis emerged during the early classical period, 200 BCE 300 CE, of Hinduism. According to Hiltubeit, a period of consolidation in the development of Hinduism took place between the time of the late Vedic Upanishad, circa 500 BCE, and the period of the rise of the Guptas, circa 320 to 467 CE, which he calls the Hindu synthesis, Brahmanic synthesis, or Orthodox synthesis. It developed in interaction with other religions and peoples. The Bhagavad Gita is the sealing achievement of this Hindu synthesis, incorporating various religious traditions. According to Hiltubeit, bhakti forms an essential ingredient of this synthesis, which incorporates bhakti into the Brahmanical fold. According to Deutsch and Dalvi, the Bhagavad Gita attempts to forge a harmony between different strands of Indian thought, jnana, dharma and bhakti. Deutsch and Dalvi note that the authors of the Bhagavad Gita must have seen the appeal of the soteriologies both of the heterodox traditions of Buddhism and Jainism and of the more orthodox ones of Samkhya and Yoga, while the Brahmanic tradition emphasized the significance of Dharma as the instrument of goodness. Shipas mentions the Bhagavad Gita as a Brahmanical text which uses the Shramanic and yogic terminology to spread the Brahmanic idea of living according to one's duty or dharma, in contrast to the yogic ideal of liberation from the workings of karma. According to Basham, Radha too sees the Bhagavad Gita as a synthesis. The influence of the Bhagavad Gita was such, that its synthesis was adapted to and incorporated into specific Indian traditions. Nicholson mentions the Shiva Gita as an adaptation of the Vishnu-oriented Bhagavad Gita into Shiva-oriented terminology, and the Isva Gita as borrowing entire verses from the Krishna-oriented Bhagavad Gita and placing them into a new Shiva-oriented context.
Status.
The Bhagavad Gita is part of the Prasthanatrayī, which also includes the Upanishads and Brahma Sutras. These are the key texts for the Vedanta, which interprets these texts to give a unified meaning. Advaita Vedanta sees the non-dualism of Atman and Brahman as its essence, whereas Bhaktipada and Vishishtadvaita see Atman and Brahman as both different and non-different, and Dvaita sees them as different. In recent times the Advaita interpretation has gained worldwide popularity, due to the Neo-Vedanta of Vivekananda and Radhakrishnan, while the Akinchya Bheda interpretation has gained worldwide popularity via the Hare Krishnas, a branch of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Although early Vedanta gives an interpretation of the Shruti texts of the Upanishads, and its main commentary the Brahman Sutras, the popularity of the Bhagavad Gita was such that it could not be neglected. It is referred to in the Brahman Sutras, and Shankara, Bhaskara and Ramanuja all three wrote commentaries on it. The Bhagavad Gita is different from the Upanishads in format and content, and accessible to all, in contrast to the Shruti, which are only to be read and heard by the higher castes. Some branches of Hinduism give it the status of an Upanishad, and consider it to be a Shruti or revealed text. According to Pandit, who gives a modern orthodox interpretation of Hinduism, since the Bhagavad Gita represents a summary of the Upanishadic teachings, it is sometimes called the Upanishad of the Upanishads.
Content. Narrative.
In the epic Mahabharata, after Sanjaya, councillor of the Kuru king Dhritarashtra, returns from the battlefield to announce the death of Bhisma, he begins recounting the details of the Mahabharata war. Bhagavad Gita forms the content of this recollection. The Gita begins before the start of the climactic Kurukshetra war, where the Pandava prince Arjuna is filled with doubt on the battlefield. Realizing that his enemies are his own relatives, beloved friends, and revered teachers, he turns to his charioteer and guide, Krishna, for advice. Responding to Arjuna's confusion and moral dilemma, Krishna explains to Arjuna his duties as a warrior and prince, elaborating on a variety of philosophical concepts.
Characters.
Arjuna, one of the Pandavas; Krishna, Arjuna's charioteer and guru; Sanjaya, councillor of the Kuru king Dhritarashtra; Dhritarashtra, Kuru king.
Overview of chapters.
Bhagavad Gita comprises 18 chapters, section 25 to 42, in the Bhishma Parva of the epic Mahabharata and consists of 700 verses. Because of differences in recensions, the verses of the Gita may be numbered in the full text of the Mahabharata as chapters 6.25-42 or as chapters 6.23-40. According to the recension of the Gita commented on by Adi Shankara, a prominent philosopher of the Vedanta school, the number of verses is 700, but there is evidence to show that old manuscripts had 745 verses. The verses themselves, composed with similes and metaphors, are poetic in nature. The verses mostly employ the range and style of the Sanskrit Anustubh meter, Chandas, and in a few expressive verses the Tristubh meter is used. The Sanskrit editions of the Gita name each chapter as a particular form of yoga. However, these chapter titles do not appear in the Sanskrit text of the Mahabharata. Swami Chidbhavananda explains that each of the 18 chapters is designated as a separate yoga because each chapter, like yoga, trains the body and the mind. He labels the first chapter Arjuna Vishada Yogam, or the yoga of Arjuna's dejection. Sir Edwin Arnold translates this chapter as the distress of Arjuna. Arjuna Visada Yoga, the distress of Arjuna contains 46 verses. Arjuna has requested Krishna to move his chariot between the two armies. His growing dejection is described as he fears losing friends and relatives as a consequence of war. Sankhya Yoga, the Book of Doctrines contains 72 verses. After asking Krishna for help, Arjuna is instructed into various subjects such as Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Sankhya Yoga, Buddha Yoga and the immortal nature of the soul. This chapter is often considered the summary of the entire Bhagavad Gita. Karma Yoga, Virtue in Work contains 43 verses. Krishna explains how Karma Yoga, that is performance of prescribed duties, but without attachment to results, is the appropriate course of action for Arjuna. Jnana Karma Sannyasa Yoga, the religion of knowledge contains 42 verses. Krishna reveals that he has lived through many births, always teaching yoga for the protection of the pious and the destruction of the impious, and stresses the importance of accepting a guru. Karma Sannyasa Yoga, religion by renouncing fruits of works contains 29 verses. Arjuna asks Krishna if it is better to forego action or to act, renunciation or discipline of action. Krishna answers that both are ways to the same goal, but that acting in Karma Yoga is superior. Dhyan Yoga or Atmasanyam Yoga, religion by self-restraint contains 47 verses. Krishna describes the Ashtanga Yoga. He further elucidates the difficulties of the mind and the techniques by which mastery of the mind might be gained. Jnana Vijnana Yoga, religion by discernment contains 30 verses. Krishna describes the absolute reality and its illusory energy Maya. Aksara Brahma Yoga, religion by devotion to the one supreme God contains 28 verses. This chapter contains eschatology of the Bhagavad Gita. Importance of the last thought before death, differences between material and spiritual worlds, and light and dark paths that a soul takes after death are described. Rajavidya Rajagya Yoga, religion by the kingly knowledge and the kingly mystery contains 34 verses. Krishna explains how his eternal energy pervades, creates, preserves, and destroys the entire universe. According to theologian Christopher Southgate, verses of this chapter of the Gita are panentheistic, while German physicist and philosopher Max Bernhard Weinstein deems the work pantheistic. Vibhuti Vistara Yoga, religion by the heavenly perfections contains 42 verses. Krishna is described as the ultimate cause of all material and spiritual existence. Arjuna accepts Krishna as the supreme being, quoting great sages who have also done so. Krishna displays his Vishvayupa, universal form, to Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, described in Visvayupadasana Yoga, Chapter 11. Visvayupadasana Yoga, the manifesting of the one and manifold contains 55 verses. On Arjuna's request, Krishna displays his universal form, Visvayupa, a theophany of a being facing every way and emitting the radiance of 1,000 suns, containing all other beings and material in existence. Bhakti Yoga, the religion of faith contains 20 verses. In this chapter Krishna glorifies the path of devotion to God. Krishna describes the process of devotional service, Bhakti Yoga. He also explains different forms of spiritual disciplines. Kshatraja Vibhaga Yoga, religion by separation of matter and spirit contains 35 verses. The difference between transient perishable physical body and the immutable eternal soul is described. The difference between individual consciousness and universal consciousness is also made clear. Gunatra Vibhaga Yoga, religion by separation from the qualities contains 27 verses. Krishna explains the three modes, gunas, of material nature pertaining to goodness, passion, and nescience. Their causes, characteristics, and influence on a living entity are also described. Purushottama Yoga, religion by attaining the supreme contains 20 verses. Krishna identifies the transcendental characteristics of God such as omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. Krishna also describes a symbolic tree, representing material existence, which has its roots in the heavens and its foliage on earth. Krishna explains that this tree should be felled with the axe of detachment, after which one can go beyond to his supreme abode. Divasura Sampad Vibhaga Yoga, the separateness of the divine and undivine, contains 24 verses. Krishna identifies the human traits of the divine and the demonic natures. He counsels that to attain the supreme destination one must give up lust, anger, greed, and discern between right and wrong action by discernment through Buddha and evidence from the scriptures. Sradhatri Vibhaga Yoga, religion by the threefold kinds of faith, contains 28 verses. Krishna qualifies the three divisions of faith, thoughts, deeds, and even eating habits corresponding to the three modes, gunas. Moksha Sannyasa Yoga, religion by deliverance and renunciation, contains 78 verses. In this chapter, the conclusions of previous 17 chapters are summed up. Krishna asks Arjuna to abandon all forms of dharma and simply surrender unto him, and describes this as the ultimate perfection of life.
Themes. Dharma.
The term dharma has a number of meanings. Fundamentally, it means, what is right. Early in the text, responding to Arjuna's despondency, Krishna asks him to follow his sadharma, the dharma that belongs to a particular man, Arjuna, as a member of a particular varna, that is, the Kshatriya. According to Vivekananda.
Dharma and heroism.
The Bhagavad Gita is set in the narrative frame of the Mahabharata, which values heroism, energy, dedication and self-sacrifice, as the dharma, holy duty of the Kshatriya, warrior. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna is exhorted by his charioteer, Krishna, among others, to stop hesitating and fulfill his Kshatriya, warrior, duty as a warrior and kill. According to Malinar, a central point in the dispute between the two parties in the Mahabharata is the question how to define the law of heroism. Malinar gives a description of the dharma of a Kshatriya, warrior, based on the Udyogaparvan, the fifth book of the Mahabharata. Michaels defines heroism as power assimilated with interest in salvation. According to Michaels. According to Malinar, Arjuna's crisis in some of the arguments put forward to call him to action are connected to the debates on war and peace in the UDP. According to Malinar, the UDP emphasizes that one must put up with fate and, the BHG personalizes the surrender one's personal interests to the power of destiny by propagating the view that accepting and enacting the fatal course of events is an act of devotion to this God and his cause.
Modern interpretations of Dharma. Svadharma and Svabhava.
The 18th chapter of the Gita examines the relationship between Svadharma and Svabhava. This chapter uses the gunas of Sankhya philosophy to present a series of typologies, and uses the same term to characterize the specific activities of the four varnas, which are distinguished by the gunas proceeding from their nature. Aurobindo modernizes the concept of Dharma and Svabhava by internalizing it, away from the social order and its duties toward one's personal capacities, which leads to a radical individualism, finding the fulfillment of the purpose of existence in the individual alone. He deduced from the Gita the doctrine that the functions of a man ought to be determined by his natural turn, gift, and capacities, that the individual should develop freely, and thereby would be best able to serve society. Gandhi's view differed from Aurobindo's view. He recognized in the concept of sadharma his idea of swadeshi, the idea that man owes his service above all to those who are nearest to him by birth and situation. To him, swadeshi was sadharma applied to one's immediate environment.
The field of Dharma.
The first reference to Dharma in the Bhagavad Gita occurs in its first verse, where Dhritarashtra refers to the Kurukshetra, the location of the battlefield, as the field of Dharma, the field of righteousness or truth. According to Fowler, Dharma in this verse may refer to the Sanatana Dharma, what Hindus understand as their religion, for it is a term that encompasses wide aspects of religious and traditional thought and is more readily used for religion. Therefore, field of action implies the field of righteousness, where truth will eventually triumph. The field of Dharma is also called the field of action by Sri Aurobindo, a freedom fighter and philosopher. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, a philosopher and the second President of India, saw that the field of Dharma is the world, Bhavsaga, which is a battleground for moral struggle.
Allegory of war.
Unlike any other religious scripture, the Bhagavad Gita broadcasts its message in the center of the battlefield. The choice of such an unholy ambience for the delivery of a philosophical discourse has been an enigma to many commentators. Several modern Indian writers have interpreted the battlefield setting as an allegory of the war within. Natheswaran writes that the Gita's subject is the war within, the struggle for self-mastery that every human being must wage if he or she is to emerge from life victorious, and that the language of battle is often found in the scriptures, for it conveys the strenuous, long, drawn-out campaign we must wage to free ourselves from the tyranny of the ego, the cause of all our suffering and sorrow. Swami Nikhilananda takes Arjuna as an allegory of Atman, Krishna as an allegory of Brahman, Arjuna's chariot as the body, and Dhritarashtra as the ignorance-filled mind. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, in his commentary on the Gita, interprets the battle as an allegory in which the battlefield is the soul and Arjuna, man's higher impulses struggling against evil. Swami Vivekananda also emphasized that the first discourse in the Gita related to the war could be taken allegorically. Vivekananda further remarked, "In Aurobindo's view, Krishna was a historical figure, but his significance in the Gita is as a symbol of the divine dealings with humanity, while Arjuna typifies a struggling human soul." However, Aurobindo rejected the interpretation that the Gita, and the Mahabharata by extension, is an allegory of the inner life, and has nothing to do with our outward human life and actions. Swami Krishnananda regards the characters and the circumstances depicted in the Bhagavad Gita as symbolic of various moods, vicissitudes, and facets of human life. He highlights the universal applicability of the Gita to human life by saying, Swami Chinmayananda writes,
Moksha, liberation.
Liberation or moksha in Vedanta philosophy is not something that can be acquired or reached. Atman, soul, the goal of moksha, is something that is always present as the essence of the self, and can be revealed by deep intuitive knowledge. While the Upanishads largely uphold such a monistic viewpoint of liberation, the Bhagavad Gita also accommodates the dualistic and theistic aspects of moksha. The Gita, while occasionally hinting at impersonal Brahman as the goal, revolves around the relationship between the self and a personal god or Saguna Brahman. A synthesis of knowledge, devotion, and desireless action is given as a prescription for Arjuna's despondence. The same combination is suggested as a way to moksha. Winthrop Sargent further explains, in the model presented by the Bhagavad Gita, every aspect of life is in fact a way of salvation.
Yoga.
Yoga in the Bhagavad Gita refers to the skill of union with the ultimate reality or the absolute. In his commentary, Zaina says that the root meaning of yoga is yoking, or preparation. He proposes the basic meaning spiritual exercise, which conveys the various nuances in the best way. Shivananda's commentary regards the 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita as having a progressive order, by which Krishna leads Arjuna up the ladder of yoga from one rung to another. The influential commentator Madhusudana Sarasvati divided the Gita's 18 chapters into 3 sections of 6 chapters each. Swami Gampurananda characterizes Madhusudana Sarasvati's system as a successive approach in which Karma Yoga leads to Bhakti Yoga, which in turn leads to Jnana Yoga. Chapters 1-6 equals Karma Yoga, the means to the final goal. Chapters 7-12 equals Bhakti Yoga or devotion. Chapters 13-18 equals Jnana Yoga or knowledge, the goal itself.
Karma Yoga.
As noted by various commentators, the Bhagavad Gita offers a practical approach to liberation in the form of Karma Yoga. The path of Karma Yoga upholds the necessity of action. However, this action is to be undertaken without any attachment to the work or desire for results. Bhagavad Gita terms this inaction in action and action in inaction, 4.18. The concept of such detached action is also called nishkam karma, a term not used in the Gita. Krishna, in the following verses, elaborates on the role actions, performed without desire and attachment, play in attaining freedom from material bondage and transmigration. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi writes, "The object of the Gita appears to me to be that of showing the most excellent way to attain self-realization, and this can be achieved by selfless action, by desireless action, by renouncing fruits of action, by dedicating all activities to God, that is, by surrendering oneself to Him body and soul." Gandhi called the Gita the gospel of selfless action. To achieve true liberation, it is important to control all mental desires and tendencies to enjoy sense pleasures. The following verses illustrate this.
Bhakti Yoga.
The introduction to Chapter 7 of the Bhagavad Gita explains bhakti as a mode of worship which consists of unceasing and loving remembrance of God. Faith, sraddha, and total surrender to a chosen God, Ishtadeva, are considered to be important aspects of bhakti. Theologian Catherine Cornell writes, "The text offers a survey of the different possible disciplines for attaining liberation through knowledge, jnana, action, karma, and loving devotion to God, bhakti, focusing on the latter as both the easiest and the highest path to salvation." Emma Sampat Kumaran, a Bhagavad Gita scholar, explains in his overview of Ramanuja's commentary on the Gita, "The point is that mere knowledge of the scriptures cannot lead to final release. Devotion, meditation, and worship are essential." Ramakrishna believed that the essential message of the Gita could be obtained by repeating the word Gita several times. Gita, 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 you begin, but then find yourself saying Targi, Targi, Targi. Targi means one who has renounced everything for God. In the following verses, Krishna elucidates the importance of bhakti. Radhakrishnan writes that the verse 11.55 is the essence of bhakti, and the substance of the whole teaching of the Gita.
Jnana Yoga.
Jnana Yoga is the path of wisdom, knowledge, and direct experience of Brahman as the ultimate reality. The path renounces both desires and actions, and is therefore depicted as being steep and very difficult in the Bhagavad Gita. This path is often associated with the non-dualistic Vedantic belief of the identity of the Atman with the Brahman. For the followers of this path, the realization of the identity of Atman and Brahman is held as the key to liberation.
Commentaries. Classical commentaries.
Bhagavad Gita integrates various schools of thought like Vedanta, Samkhya, Yoga, and other theistic ideas. Therefore, it remains a popular text for commentators belonging to various philosophical schools. However, its composite nature also leads to varying interpretations of the text. In the words of Misohiriyana, is one of the hardest books to interpret, which accounts for the numerous commentaries on it, each differing from the rest in one essential point or the other. Different translators and commentators have widely differing views on what multi-layered Sanskrit words and passages signify, and their presentation in English depending on the sampradaya they are affiliated to. The oldest and most influential medieval commentary was that of the founder of the Vedanta school of extreme non-dualism, Adi Shankara, 788–820 AD. Also known as Shankaracharya, Sanskrit, Sankaracharya. Shankara's commentary was based on a recension of the Gita containing 700 verses, and that recension has been widely adopted by others. Ramanujacharya's commentary chiefly seeks to show that the discipline of devotion to God, Bhakti Yoga, is the way of salvation. Madhva, a commentator of the Vedanta school, whose dates are given either as 1199 to 1276 CE, or as 1238 to 1317 CE, also known as Madhvacharya, Sanskrit, Madhvacharya, wrote a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, which exemplifies the thinking of the dualist school. Winthrop Sugeen quotes a dualistic assertion of the Madhva's school that there is an eternal and complete distinction between the supreme, the many souls, and matter and its divisions. His commentary on the Gita is called Gita Bhashya. It has been annotated on by many ancient pontiffs of Dvaita Vedanta school like Padmanabhatirtha, Jaratirtha, and Raghavendra Tirtha. In the Shaiva tradition, the renowned philosopher Abhinavagupta, 10–11th century CE, has written a commentary on a slightly variant recension called Jatartha Samgraya. Other classical commentators include Nimbarka, 1162 CE, Vidyadhiraja Tirtha, Vallabha, 1479 CE, Madhusudana Saraswati, Raghavendra Tirtha, Vanamurli Mishra, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, 1486 CE, Waldnyaneshwar, 1275–1296 CE, translated and commented on the Gita in Marathi, in his book Jnaneshwari.
Independence movement.
At a time when Indian nationalists were seeking an indigenous basis for social and political action, Bhagavad Gita provided them with a rationale for their activism and fight against injustice. Among nationalists, notable commentaries were written by Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Mahatma Gandhi, who used the text to help inspire the Indian independence movement. Tilak wrote his commentary while in jail during the period 1910 to 1911, serving a 6-year sentence imposed by the British colonial government in India for sedition. While noting that the Gita teaches possible paths to liberation, his commentary places most emphasis on karma yoga. No book was more central to Gandhi's life and thought than the Bhagavad Gita, which he referred to as his spiritual dictionary. During his stay in Yeravda jail in 1929, Gandhi wrote a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita in Gujarati. The Gujarati manuscript was translated into English by Mahadv Desai, who provided an additional introduction and commentary. It was published with a foreword by Gandhi in 1946. Mahatma Gandhi expressed his love for the Gita in these words.
Other modern commentaries.
Among notable modern commentators of the Bhagavad Gita are Aurobindo, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, and Chinmayananda, who took a syncretistic approach to the text. Paramahansa Yogananda's 2-volume commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, called God Talks with Arjuna, the Bhagavad Gita, was released 1995. Exploring the Gita's psychological, spiritual, and metaphysical depths, Yogananda reveals the innermost essence of this majestic scripture while presenting an enlightening and deeply encouraging guide to who we are, why we were created, and our place and purpose in the vast cosmic scheme of things. Natheswaran has also written a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. It examines the applicability of the principles of Gita to the problems of modern life. Other notable commentators include Jeanine Fowler, Ithamar Theodore, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and Bal Gangadhar Tilak.
Hindu revivalism and neo-Hindu movements.
Although Vivekananda did not write any commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, his works contained numerous references to the Gita, such as his lectures on the 4 yogas, Bhakti, Jnana, Karma, and Raja. Through the message of the Gita, Vivekananda sought to energize the people of India to claim their own dormant but strong identity. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay thought that the answer to the problems that beset Hindu society was a revival of Hinduism in its purity, which lay in the reinterpretation of Bhagavad Gita for a new India. Aurobindo saw Bhagavad Gita as a scripture of the future religion, and suggested that Hinduism had acquired a much wider relevance through the Gita. Shivananda called Bhagavad Gita the most precious jewel of Hindu literature, and suggested its introduction into the curriculum of Indian schools and colleges. In the lectures Chinmayananda gave, on tours undertaken to revive of moral and spiritual values of the Hindus, he borrowed the concept of Jnana Yaja, or the worship to invoke divine wisdom, from the Gita. He viewed the Gita as a universal scripture to turn a person from a state of agitation and confusion to a state of complete vision, inner contentment, and dynamic action. Teachings of International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, a Gaudiya Vaishnava religious organization which spread rapidly in North America in 1970s and 1980s, are based on a translation of the Gita called Bhagavad Gita as it is by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada.
Scholarly translations.
The first English translation of the Bhagavad Gita was done by Charles Wilkins in 1785. In 1981, Larson listed more than 40 English translations of the Gita, stating that a complete listing of Gita translations and a related secondary bibliography would be nearly endless. 514 He stated that overall, there is a massive translational tradition in English, pioneered by the British, solidly grounded philologically by the French and Germans, provided with its indigenous roots by a rich heritage of modern Indian comment and reflection, extended into various disciplinary areas by Americans, and having generated in our time a broadly based cross-cultural awareness of the importance of the Bhagavad Gita both as an expression of a specifically Indian spirituality and as one of the great religious classics of all time. 518 Sanskrit scholar Barbara Stoller Miller produced a translation in 1986 intended to emphasize the poem's influence and current context within English literature, especially the works of T.S. Eliot, Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. The translation was praised by scholars as well as literary critics and became one of most continually popular translations to date. The Gita has also been translated into other European languages. In 1808, passages from the Gita were part of the first direct translation of Sanskrit into German, appearing in a book through which Friedrich Schlegel became known as the founder of Indian philology in Germany. Swami Ramadrikaya released the first Braille version of the scripture, with the original Sanskrit text and a Hindi commentary, on November 30, 2007. The former Turkish scholar-politician, Gülen Tükevet translated several Sanskrit scriptures including the Gita into Turkish language. Mahavadwa Nuragava Iyengar translated the Gita in Tamil and Sandam meter poetic form.
Contemporary popularity.
With the translation and study of the Bhagavad Gita by Western scholars beginning in the early 18th century, the Bhagavad Gita gained a growing appreciation and popularity. According to the well-known Indian historian and writer Khushwant Singh, Rudyard Kipling's famous poem If, is the essence of the message of the Gita in English.
Appraisal.
The Bhagavad Gita has been highly praised, not only by prominent Indians including Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi and Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, but also by Aldous Huxley, Henry David Thoreau, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Carl Jung, Hermann Hesse, and others. The Gita's emphasis on selfless service was a prime source of inspiration for Gandhi, who said, Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India, commented on the Gita. J. Robert Oppenheimer, American physicist and director of the Manhattan Project, learned Sanskrit in 1933 and read the Bhagavad Gita in the original form, citing it later as one of the most influential books to shape his philosophy of life. Upon witnessing the world's first nuclear test in 1945, he later said he had thought of the quotation Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, verse 32 from chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita.
Adaptations.
Philip Glass retold the story of Gandhi's early development as an activist in South Africa through the text of the Gita in the opera Satyagraha, 1979. The entire libretto of the opera consists of sayings from the Gita sung in the original Sanskrit. In Douglas Cuomo's Arjuna's Dilemma, the philosophical dilemma faced by Arjuna is dramatized in operatic form with a blend of Indian and Western music styles. The 1993 Sanskrit film, Bhagavad Gita, directed by G.V. Iyer, won the 1993 National Film Award for Best Film. The 1995 novel and 2000 golf movie The Legend of Bhagavan are roughly based on the Bhagavad Gita.